Margaret Chen had worked in luxury hospitality for 15 years, but nothing could have prepared her for the call that came on a rainy Tuesday morning in October. The voice on the other end was crisp, formal, and spoke with the kind of authority that made her straighten her posture even though no one could see her.
"Miss Chen, this is James Whitmore from the Royal Protocol Office. We understand you specialize in high-security event management.
We have a position that requires your immediate attention and absolute discretion." 3 days later, Margaret found herself standing before the imposing gates of Thornfield Estate, a sprawling manor house that served as a private retreat for members of the royal family. The morning mist clung to the manicured gardens like secrets refusing to be revealed. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her navy blazer, a nervous habit she thought she had conquered years ago. The estate manager, a stern woman named Victoria Ashworth, met her at the entrance. Victoria's silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her pale blue eyes seemed to catalogue every detail of Margaret's appearance with mechanical precision. "Welcome to Thornfield, Miss Chen. I trust you understand the gravity of your position here. You will be overseeing all dining arrangements for their Royal Highnesses during their monthly retreats. However, there are certain protocols that must be followed without question or deviation." As they walked through corridors lined with oil paintings of long-dead aristocrats, Victoria began explaining the rules. Margaret had expected the usual security measures, background checks for staff, restricted access areas, communication protocols. What she hadn't expected was the bizarre specificity of the dining restrictions. No guest may sit with their back to the east wall during dinner service. The salt must always be passed clockwise around the table, never counterclockwise. And, under no circumstances should anyone mention the year 1997 in conversation during meals.
Margaret's eyebrows furrowed. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that last one?"
Victoria's expression remained unchanged.
"These rules have been in place for 25 years, Miss Chen. They are not suggestions.
They are absolute requirements for anyone who wishes to dine at the royal table." The first week passed in a blur of carefully orchestrated meals. Margaret watched as guests unconsciously adjusted their seating arrangements, as if guided by some invisible force. She noticed how conversations would halt mid-sentence when someone began to mention anything related to late 1990s events. The staff moved with a choreographed precision that spoke of years of practice. It was during the second week that Margaret met Thomas Hartwell, the head butler who had served at Thornfield for over 3 decades. Thomas was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and hands that bore the calluses of decades of service. Unlike Victoria's cold efficiency, Thomas carried himself with a warmth that made the vast estate feel slightly less intimidating. "You're wondering about the rules, aren't you?" Thomas asked one evening as they reviewed the next day's menu in the butler's pantry. His voice was barely above a whisper, as if the walls themselves might be listening.
Margaret nodded.
"I've worked with royalty before, but never with such specific requirements. The east wall restriction, the salt passing, the year ban, none of it makes logical sense from a security standpoint."
Thomas glanced toward the doorway, ensuring they were alone.
His weathered face took on a distant expression, as if he were looking back through layers of time. "There was an incident," he said slowly.
"August 15, 1997.
A dinner party that changed everything here at Thornfield.
8 guests, including 2 members of the royal family. What happened that night?"
He paused, running his hand along the polished silver service laid out on the counter.
"Well, let's just say some wounds never heal properly, and some precautions become permanent."
Margaret felt a chill run down her spine.
"What kind of incident?"
But Thomas had already begun collecting the silverware, his moment of openness closing like a door.
"Some stories aren't mine to tell, Miss Chen.
But I will say this: every rule in this house exists because someone paid a price for its absence."
The following morning brought news that would test every protocol Thornfield had established. Prince Edward, the Queen's youngest son, announced he would be hosting an impromptu dinner for 6 international diplomats.
The guest list included the ambassador from France, whose wife had a particular fondness for discussing historical events, and the cultural attaché from Germany, known for his academic interest in late 20th century British politics.
Margaret spent the morning in crisis management mode.
She studied the seating chart with the intensity of a chess master, trying to arrange the guests in a way that would naturally discourage anyone from facing the problematic east wall. The dining room at Thornfield was circular, with windows on all sides, but the east wall held a massive mirror that reflected the entire table, a mirror that had hung there since the estate's construction in 1847. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself drawn to that mirror. There was something unsettling about it, beyond its obvious prominence. The glass was old, with slight imperfections that created strange distortions. When she stood in certain positions, her reflection seemed to shift and waver, as if the mirror remembered other faces, other times. Beautiful piece, isn't it? Margaret spun around to find Victoria standing behind her, having approached with the silent grace of a cat. It's certainly commanding, Margaret replied carefully. Victoria moved to stand beside her, both women now facing the mirror. Their reflections stood side by side, Margaret young and uncertain, Victoria aged and resolute. That mirror has seen every significant meal served in this room for over a century and a half, Victoria said. Celebrations, negotiations, confrontations. It's witnessed proposals and betrayals, peace treaties and declarations of war. If mirrors could speak, that one would have quite a story to tell. Margaret studied Victoria's reflection. And if it could speak, would it tell us about August 15, 1997? Victoria's reflection smiled, but it was a cold expression that didn't reach her eyes. Mirrors don't speak, Ms. Chen. They only reflect what's placed before them. Sometimes that's enough to reveal more than people intend to show. The dinner guests began arriving at 7 o'clock sharp. Margaret positioned herself in the small adjoining room where she could monitor the service without being intrusive. Through the serving window, she watched as the diplomats were seated according to her carefully planned arrangement. The French ambassador's wife was placed at the southern end of the table, facing away from the problematic mirror. The German cultural attaché found himself positioned near the windows overlooking the garden. Prince Edward entered with his characteristic easy charm, greeting each guest personally before taking his seat at the head of the table. He was a man in his late 50s, with silver threading through his dark hair and laugh lines that spoke of a life spent in public service. His presence immediately lightened the atmosphere in the room. The first two courses proceeded flawlessly. Conversation flowed naturally between topics of art, literature, and current diplomatic relations. Margaret began to relax, thinking perhaps this evening would pass without incident. Then, the French ambassador's wife, Madame Dubois, made an innocent comment about the wine selection. "This Bordeaux is exceptional," she said, raising her glass toward the candlelight. "It reminds me of a bottle we shared during our posting in London in the late 90s. Such a difficult time for everyone, especially after what happened in Paris that August." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Margaret watched as every member of the serving staff froze mid-motion. Prince Edward's fork paused halfway to his mouth. The only sound was the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Thomas, serving from the sideboard, moved with swift precision. "Perhaps Madame would prefer the champagne with the next course," he suggested smoothly, already reaching for a different bottle. "We have a particularly fine vintage from 2003. Madame Dubois blinked, seemingly confused by the sudden shift in attention, but accepted the champagne graciously. The conversation gradually resumed, steered carefully away from any temporal references by Prince Edward's skilled social navigation. But Margaret had seen something in that moment of frozen silence. In the great mirror's reflection, she had glimpsed expressions that revealed more than words ever could. Fear, guilt, and something that looked almost like grief had flickered across the faces of both Prince Edward and Thomas. After the guests departed and the dining room had been cleared, Margaret found herself alone with her questions. She stood once again before the mirror, studying her own reflection and trying to understand what secrets lay hidden in its silvered surface. "You're developing quite a fascination with that mirror." Margaret turned to find Thomas approaching, carrying a silver tray with 2 cups of tea. "I keep feeling like I'm missing something important," she admitted, accepting the offered cup gratefully. "Everyone acts as if they're walking through a minefield, but no one will explain where the mines are buried." Thomas sipped his tea thoughtfully. "Sometimes the most dangerous mines are the ones we bury ourselves, Ms. Chen. Sometimes we create rules not to protect ourselves from external threats, but to protect ourselves from our own memories." "What happened in 1997, Thomas? What really happened?" The old butler's hands trembled slightly as he set down his cup. For a long moment, he seemed to wage an internal battle between loyalty and truth. "There was a young woman," he said finally. "Beautiful, kind, beloved by everyone she met. She dined at this very table on August 15, 1997. It was meant to be a celebration, a small, intimate dinner before she returned to London. She sat facing the east wall, right where that mirror could capture her every expression. Margaret felt her heart rate increase. What happened to her? Thomas's voice became barely audible. 16 hours later, she was dead. A car accident in Paris. The last photograph of her alive was taken by a hidden camera, reflected in that mirror during dinner. The press got hold of it, published it without permission. Her final private moment became public property. The pieces began falling into place in Margaret's mind. The East Wall restriction, the obsessive privacy measures, the ban on discussing 1997, it all made terrible sense now. Since that night, Thomas continued, no one sits facing that mirror. No one discusses that year. And, no photographer, no camera, no recording device of any kind is ever allowed in this room during dinner service. Some wounds cut so deep that the only healing is to ensure they never happen again. Margaret stared at the mirror with new understanding. It wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was a monument to tragedy, a daily reminder of how quickly private joy could become public sorrow. The family still comes here for dinner, she asked. Every month, Thomas confirmed. This room holds their happiest memories of her, but also their greatest trauma. They've never been able to let go of either. As Margaret prepared to leave that evening, she took one last look at the dining room. In the dim light, the mirror seemed less threatening and more melancholy, like a widow dressed in silver, reflecting not just images but emotions, memories, and the weight of unspoken grief. She finally understood that her job here wasn't just about managing logistics or following protocol. She was a guardian of sacred space, a protector of healing hearts, and a keeper of secrets that some families could never afford to have revealed. The rules at Thornfield weren't odd restrictions imposed by paranoid royalty. They were love letters written in the language of protection, ensuring that never again would private grief become public spectacle, that never again would a moment of joy be transformed into a lifetime of regret. As she drove away through the misty evening, Margaret realized she was no longer just an employee of the royal family. She had become part of their extended family of secrets, bound by loyalty to protect not just their privacy, but their ability to remember their loved one with joy rather than pain. The next morning would bring new challenges, new guests, new opportunities for those carefully constructed rules to be tested. But, tonight, Margaret finally understood why every place setting mattered, why every reflection must be guarded, and why some security restrictions were less about protecting bodies and more about protecting souls. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret's conversation with Thomas, and she had settled into the rhythm of Thornfield's unspoken rules. Each dinner service felt like a carefully choreographed dance, where every movement had been practiced countless times to avoid disaster. She had become skilled at reading the subtle signals, the way Victoria's left eyebrow would twitch when a guest approached a forbidden topic, the gentle but firm redirections Thomas would offer when conversation strayed toward dangerous territory. But Margaret was beginning to notice something else. Despite the elaborate precautions, despite the rules that governed every aspect of the dining experience, there was one person for whom these restrictions seemed to carry a deeper, more personal weight. Princess Catherine, Prince Edward's sister-in-law, visited Thornfield twice a month. She was a woman in her early 40s, elegant in the way that seemed effortless but, Margaret knew, required tremendous discipline. Catherine moved through the estate with a grace that spoke of years of public scrutiny, but there was something haunted in her green eyes, a sadness that no amount of royal training could completely mask. During Catherine's visits, the security protocols intensified. Additional staff members appeared, discreet individuals who seemed to blend into the wallpaper but whose watchful eyes never stopped moving. The dining room received extra attention, with every surface polished to perfection and every potential reflection source carefully angled away from the seating areas. It was during Catherine's November visit that Margaret first noticed the photographs. She had been reviewing the evening's seating arrangement when she spotted Thomas in the library adjacent to the dining room. He was standing before a collection of framed photographs, his withered hands holding what appeared to be a picture frame. His shoulders were shaking slightly, and Margaret realized with a start that the composed, unflappable butler was crying. Margaret hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to intrude on what was clearly a private moment. But something about Thomas's grief drew her forward. On closer inspection, she could see that the photographs showed the royal family through various decades, Christmas celebrations, summer picnics, formal state events. They were the kind of personal family photos that never made it into official publications, capturing genuine moments of laughter and affection. In Thomas's hands was a photograph that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. It showed a young woman with blonde hair and sparkling blue eyes, seated at the very table where Margaret now orchestrated dinners. The woman was laughing at something off camera, her face radiant with joy. Beside her sat Prince Edward, younger and less weathered, his arm around her shoulders in a gesture of pure brotherly affection. She loved family dinners, Thomas said quietly, not turning around but somehow sensing Margaret's presence. Said they were the only times she felt truly normal, truly herself. No cameras, no protocols, just family sharing a meal and telling stories. Margaret moved closer, studying the photograph. The dining room looked different in the image, brighter, warmer. The great mirror on the east wall reflected the entire scene, multiplying the laughter and creating a sense of infinite celebration. This was taken just 3 days before. Thomas's voice trailed off, but Margaret understood. 3 days before August 15, 1997. 3 days before the last dinner, before the hidden camera, before everything changed forever. Thomas, Margaret said gently, may I ask you something? Why does Princess Catherine seem to carry this burden more heavily than the others? The old butler finally turned to face her, his eyes red-rimmed but steady. Because Catherine blames herself. She thinks if she hadn't insisted on that particular seating arrangement, if she hadn't suggested they use the formal dining room that night, if she had noticed the photographer lurking outside. He shook his head. Grief makes us cruel to ourselves, Ms. Chen. It convinces us that we could have prevented the unpreventable. That evening's dinner was smaller than usual, just Catherine, Prince Edward, and 2 close family friends who had been part of their inner circle for decades. Margaret had arranged the seating with extra care, ensuring that Catherine would be positioned as far from the east wall as possible while still maintaining the natural flow of conversation. The meal began smoothly. Catherine seemed more relaxed than usual, even laughing at Prince Edward's story about his recent visit to a youth centre in Manchester. For a moment, Margaret allowed herself to hope that this evening would pass without incident. Then, the conversation turned to upcoming holiday plans. I was thinking we might spend Christmas at Sandringham this year, Prince Edward said, cutting into his lamb. The children always love the snow there, and Mother enjoys the quieter atmosphere. Catherine's face brightened. That sounds lovely. We haven't all been together for Christmas since. She paused, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. Since before. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Margaret watched as Catherine's expression shifted, the careful composure cracking slightly to reveal the raw pain beneath. The reference to family Christmases had clearly triggered a memory, a connection to holidays that would never again include the person whose absence defined every gathering. Since the renovations, Prince Edward finished smoothly, providing Catherine with a safe exit from the dangerous conversational territory. The East Wing is finally ready for guests again. But the damage was done. Catherine set down her fork and reached for her water glass with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. Margaret noticed that Catherine's gaze had drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the great mirror on the east wall, the mirror she had been carefully positioned to avoid. In the reflection, Margaret could see Catherine's face clearly. The princess was staring at the mirror not with fear, but with a kind of desperate longing, as if she were trying to see through the present moment to that last dinner 25 years ago. As if she were searching for a glimpse of the person who would never again sit at this table. Excuse me, Catherine said quietly, rising from her chair. I believe I need some air. She moved toward the terrace doors with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to exit difficult situations without causing alarm. But Margaret could see the truth in her posture, the slight forward lean that spoke of barely contained emotion, the controlled breathing of someone fighting tears. Prince Edward watched his sister-in-law leave, his own face reflecting a mixture of understanding and helplessness. Some evenings are harder than others, he said to the remaining guests, his voice carrying decades of experience in managing family crises with dignity. Margaret excused herself from the service supervision and followed Catherine outside. The November air was sharp and clear, with a wind that carried the scent of fallen leaves and approaching winter. Catherine stood at the stone balustrade overlooking the garden, her evening shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Your Royal Highness, Margaret began carefully, is there anything I can do to help? Catherine turned, and Margaret was struck by how young she looked in the moonlight, despite the lines of grief around her eyes. Do you know the hardest part about losing someone you love, Margaret? I'm not sure I do, ma'am. It's not the big occasions, the birthdays they miss, the holidays without them. Those you expect to be difficult. It's the small moments when you forget, just for a second, that they're gone. When you find yourself saving the best story of your day to tell them later, or when you reach for the phone to call them about something silly. Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper.
Tonight, when Edward mentioned Christmas, I was about to suggest we invite. She paused.
I was about to suggest we invite someone who's been dead for 25 years.
Margaret felt her heart constrict with sympathy. Grief doesn't follow rules or timelines, Your Royal Highness. Even after all these years. Do you think we're foolish? Catherine asked suddenly. All these restrictions, all these rules designed to avoid mentioning her or thinking about that night? Maybe we're just prolonging the pain instead of learning to live with it.
It was a question Margaret had been wrestling with since her first week at Thornfield.
Were these protocols helping the family heal, or were they keeping old wounds fresh by constantly focusing attention on what couldn't be discussed? I think, Margaret said carefully, that everyone grieves differently.
What feels protective to one person might feel restrictive to another.
But what I've observed here is a family trying to preserve space for joy.
The rules aren't about erasing her memory, they're about protecting your ability to remember her with love instead of pain. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the gardens where autumn had painted the trees in shades of gold and crimson.
She loved this view, she said finally.
Used to say it looked like a painting that changed with every season. She'd stand right here after dinner sometimes, planning which flowers to plant in the spring, discussing how to improve the walking paths. She sounds like she was very connected to this place. She said Thornfield was the only place she could truly breathe. No photographers hiding in bushes, no crowds analyzing her every gesture.
Just family and friends and conversations that didn't have to be performed for anyone else. Catherine's voice grew stronger. That's why we keep coming back, you know.
Not despite what happened, but because of all the beautiful things that happened here before that night. Margaret began to understand something crucial about the family's relationship with Thornfield. They weren't prisoners of their grief, they were guardians of their joy. The elaborate precautions weren't just about avoiding painful triggers, they were about preserving a sacred space where love could exist without the intrusion of tragedy.
Your Royal Highness, Margaret said, what if we tried something different? What if, instead of just avoiding painful topics, we created opportunities to share happy memories? Structured moments where her presence could be acknowledged positively? Catherine looked intrigued but cautious. What do you mean? Well, the Christmas planning that triggered tonight's difficulty, what if that became an opportunity to discuss how she would have wanted Christmas celebrated? What flowers she would have chosen for the table arrangements, what food she enjoyed, what traditions she valued.
Transform the conversation from something that accidentally excludes her to something that purposefully includes her. The idea seemed to resonate with Catherine. For the first time since the evening began, her posture relaxed slightly. The staff here, Thomas, Victoria, even you all protect us so carefully from accidentally encountering reminders of our loss, Catherine said. But maybe what we need protection from isn't the memories themselves, but the suddenness of them. The way they ambush us when we're not prepared.
Margaret nodded enthusiastically. Exactly.
Instead of random, unexpected reminders that bring pain, we could create intentional, prepared moments that bring comfort. They spent the next hour discussing possibilities. Catherine shared stories about the person they had lost, her sense of humor, her love of simple pleasures, her gift for making everyone around her feel important and valued. As she spoke, Catherine's face transformed. The lines of tension eased, replaced by the soft expression of someone accessing beloved memories. When they finally returned to the dining room, the guests had finished their meal and moved to the salon for coffee. Catherine rejoined the group, and Margaret noticed that her demeanor had shifted. She was still careful, still respectful of the unspoken boundaries, but there was a new quality to her presence, a sense of someone who had found a way to carry love alongside loss. Later that evening, as Margaret supervised the final cleanup, Thomas approached her in the butler's pantry. I noticed Princess Catherine seemed different when she returned from the terrace, he observed.
More settled, somehow. Margaret smiled. We discussed some possibilities for adjusting how we handle certain topics.
Not eliminating the protections, but adding some positive elements to balance them.
Thomas nodded approvingly. 25 years is a long time to define a relationship primarily by absence. Perhaps it's time we learned how to define it by presence as well.
As Margaret prepared to leave Thornfield that night, she paused once more in the dining room. The great mirror reflected her solitary figure, but, for the first time, she didn't feel intimidated by its presence. Instead, she felt a sense of possibility. The rules would remain: the careful seating arrangements, the watchful staff, the protocols designed to protect privacy and prevent pain. But, within those boundaries, perhaps there was room for something new. Perhaps there was space for healing that honored both the reality of loss and the persistence of love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new guests, new opportunities to test the delicate balance between protection and healing. But, tonight, Margaret felt she had learned something important about the difference between hiding from grief and creating sanctuary within it. The drive home through the dark countryside felt different than usual. Instead of carrying the weight of secrets and restrictions, Margaret felt she was carrying hope that even the most carefully guarded hearts could find new ways to beat, new rhythms that honored both memory and possibility. December brought an unexpected challenge to Thornfield that would test every protocol Margaret had learned and force the family to confront their carefully constructed boundaries in ways they never anticipated. The call came on a Wednesday morning from Victoria, her usually composed voice carrying an undercurrent of tension that immediately put Margaret on alert. "We have a situation," Victoria said without preamble. "Prince William has requested to bring his eldest son, Prince George, to dinner this Friday." It would be the young prince's first formal dinner at Thornfield. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. A 17-year-old prince who had never experienced the elaborate restrictions of Thornfield, who had no understanding of the invisible boundaries that governed every conversation, every gesture, every glance at the east wall mirror. It was a disaster waiting to happen. "Has anyone briefed him on the protocols?" Margaret asked. "That's the complication. Prince William specifically requested that we not burden George with what he calls excessive restrictions. He wants his son to experience Thornfield as a normal family gathering place, not as a museum of carefully managed grief." Margaret spent the next 2 days in intensive preparation. She studied every aspect of Prince George's public life, looking for clues about his personality, his interests, his likely conversation topics. What she discovered both reassured and terrified her. George was by all accounts a thoughtful, intelligent young man with a deep interest in history and current events. He was known for asking probing questions and had recently written a school essay about the impact of media intrusion on public figures. Under normal circumstances, these would be admirable qualities. At Thornfield, they represented potential catastrophe. The guest list for Friday's dinner included Prince William and Prince George, Princess Catherine, Prince Edward, and 2 longtime family friends, Sir James Morrison, a retired diplomat, and his wife Lady Eleanor. Margaret arranged the seating with surgical precision, placing George at the southern end of the table with his back to the gardens, as far from the problematic east wall as physically possible. The afternoon of the dinner, Margaret arrived at Thornfield to find an unusual energy in the air. The staff moved with even greater precision than usual, their faces reflecting a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Thomas appeared more nervous than Margaret had ever seen him, checking and rechecking the table settings with obsessive attention to detail. "First time we've had one of the younger generation for a formal dinner," he confided to Margaret as they reviewed the evening's menu. "Not since." He paused, then shook his head. "Well, not for many years. It feels significant, somehow." Victoria had arrived early and was conducting what could only be described as a rehearsal with the serving staff. Every movement was choreographed, every potential conversation topic mapped out in advance. Margaret watched the preparations with growing unease, recognizing the signs of a team preparing for battle rather than hosting a family dinner. Prince William and Prince George arrived at precisely 7 o'clock. Margaret watched from her position in the adjoining room as father and son entered the dining room together. William moved with the easy confidence of someone who had navigated Thornfield's peculiarities since childhood, but George's face showed open curiosity as he took in the formal setting. George was taller than Margaret had expected, with his father's earnest expression and his grandfather's thoughtful eyes. He shook hands with each adult guest with practiced courtesy, but Margaret could see him cataloging details, the elaborate place settings, the careful positioning of the chairs, the way the staff hovered at the edges of the room with unusual intensity. "What an incredible mirror," George commented as they took their seats, his gaze drawn naturally to the imposing reflection on the east wall. "It must have quite a history." The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of tension that Margaret could feel from her observation post. She watched as every adult at the table found suddenly urgent reasons to focus on their napkins, their water glasses, anything except acknowledging George's innocent observation. William smoothly redirected his son's attention. "The gardens are particularly beautiful this time of year, don't you think?" Mother always said December light was the most flattering for entertaining.
But George was not easily distracted.
Margaret could see his mind working, processing the odd response to his comment, noting the way conversation had been abruptly steered away from the mirror. He was too well trained to press the issue immediately, but she could tell he was storing the moment for later consideration. The first course proceeded carefully. Prince Edward launched into a story about his recent visit to Scotland, describing the Highland landscape with infectious enthusiasm. George listened politely, but Margaret noticed his eyes occasionally drifting back to the mirror, studying its ornate frame and the way it reflected the entire table scene. During the second course, George made another innocent comment that sent fresh waves of tension through the room. "I've been reading about media ethics in school," he said, cutting into his salmon. "It's fascinating how the relationship between public figures and photographers has evolved over the years. Especially after some of the more intrusive incidents in the late 90s. This time, the silence was more pronounced. Margaret watched as Catherine's fork paused halfway to her mouth, as Thomas's hand trembled slightly while pouring wine. Prince Edward's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Media ethics is certainly an evolving field," Sir James said diplomatically. "Perhaps we might discuss your other subjects? I understand you're quite accomplished in history." But George had clearly noticed the pattern of deflection. Margaret could see understanding beginning to dawn in his intelligent eyes, the realization that he had stumbled into forbidden territory not once but twice, and that the adults were working very hard to shield him from something. "Is there something about this room I should know?" George asked directly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested he would not be easily redirected again. "Everyone seems nervous about certain topics, and I keep feeling like I'm missing something important." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret held her breath, watching as the carefully constructed protocols of 25 years collided with the honest curiosity of a 17-year-old who had been raised to expect truthfulness from his family. William looked to Prince Edward, who glanced at Catherine, who turned toward the mirror as if seeking guidance from its silvered surface. The weight of their shared history pressed down on the room like a physical force. It was Catherine who finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "George, there are some family stories that carry particular weight. Some memories that we've learned to handle with special care. Not because they're shameful or wrong, but because they're precious and painful at the same time." George leaned forward, his attention completely focused on his step-grandmother. "Does it have to do with Aunt Diana?" The name fell into the room like a thunderclap. For 25 years, that name had never been spoken during dinner at Thornfield. It had been protected, avoided, treated as too sacred and too dangerous to voice aloud in this space. Margaret watched as every person at the table seemed to simultaneously hold their breath. In the great mirror, she could see their reflected faces, a tableau of shock, fear, and something that might have been relief. "Yes," Catherine said simply. "It does." The admission seemed to break something open in the room. Not destructively, but like the first crack in ice that allows spring water to flow underneath. Margaret could feel the shift in atmosphere, the way decades of careful control suddenly gave way to something more honest and immediate. "She used to love having dinner here," Prince Edward said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "She said it was the only place she could truly relax, truly be herself without worrying about cameras or public opinion." George nodded solemnly. "And the last time she was here, there were photographers?" The question was asked with such gentle understanding that Margaret felt her eyes fill with tears. This young man had grasped in minutes what had taken her weeks to understand, that the elaborate restrictions weren't about paranoia or excessive security, but about protecting a family's right to grieve privately. "There was one photographer," Catherine said. "Hidden outside, using telephoto lenses. He captured her last private moments with family and sold them to the press. We've spent 25 years ensuring that never happens again. That's why I can't sit facing the east wall," George said, the pieces clicking into place. "That's why no one talks about certain years or events. You've been trying to create a safe space where family can be family without becoming public property." The simplicity and accuracy of his assessment seemed to surprise the adults. Margaret watched as they looked at this teenager with new respect, recognizing that his generation might understand privacy violations in ways their own generation was still learning to articulate. "The question is," George continued thoughtfully, "whether these protections are still serving their purpose, or whether they become limitations that prevent us from talking about someone who should be remembered with joy instead of fear." His words echoed the conversation Margaret had with Catherine weeks earlier, but, coming from him, they carried different weight. This was Diana's nephew, someone who carried her legacy forward into a new generation, offering a perspective unclouded by the trauma of loss. "What would you suggest?" William asked his son, and Margaret could hear both pride and curiosity in his voice. George looked around the table, his gaze finally settling on the great mirror that had been the source of so much anxiety. "I think Aunt Diana would want to be part of family dinners, not excluded from them. Maybe instead of avoiding her memory, we could honor it. Maybe the anniversary of her last dinner here could become a celebration of her life instead of a reminder of her death." The suggestion was so unexpected, so completely contrary to everything Thornfield had represented for decades, that no one spoke for a long moment. Margaret watched as each person at the table processed the possibility not of forgetting their protective protocols, but of transforming them into something affirmative rather than defensive. "You're suggesting we intentionally remember instead of accidentally forget?" Catherine asked. "I'm suggesting we take control of the narrative," George replied with a maturity that seemed beyond his years. "Right now, her memory haunts this room because you're all afraid of encountering it unexpectedly. But, what if you invited her memory? What if this room became a place where stories about her were welcome instead of forbidden?" Thomas appeared beside the table, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "If I may, your highnesses," he said quietly. "The young prince has a point. We've spent so many years protecting ourselves from pain that we may have forgotten how to access the joy." Margaret watched as the conversation continued, seeing 25 years of carefully maintained boundaries being questioned and, potentially transformed by the honest perspective of someone who had never known Diana in life but understood her significance to his family's identity. As the evening progressed, something remarkable happened. The adults began sharing memories, tentatively at first, then, with growing confidence. Prince Edward described Diana's terrible sense of humor and her gift for making even formal dinners feel like casual family gatherings. Catherine talked about Diana's love of gossip and her ability to make everyone feel like the most important person in the room. George listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that drew out more stories, more laughter, more moments of connection with the person whose absence had defined this space for so long. Margaret realized she was witnessing something historic, not just the breaking of long-standing protocols, but the transformation of a wound into a bridge. The restrictions would remain, because privacy and security were still essential. But, within those boundaries, there was now room for something new, the possibility of remembering with love instead of fearing the pain of remembrance. As the dinner ended and the guests prepared to leave, George approached the great mirror one final time. Instead of avoiding it, he stood directly in front of it, studying his own reflection alongside the reflected images of his family. "I think she would have liked seeing all of us together," he said quietly. "I think she would have wanted to know that even when she couldn't be here physically, she was still part of what made this family special." Margaret watched from the doorway as the family gathered around George, all of them facing the mirror that had been a source of anxiety for so long. In that moment, the mirror transformed from a reminder of violation into a symbol of inclusion, a way for Diana to be present at future family gatherings, not as a source of pain but as a source of love. The evening had changed everything and nothing. The security protocols would remain, the careful management of privacy would continue, the protection of family intimacy would persist. But, now, within those boundaries, there was space for healing that honored both the reality of loss and the persistence of love. 6 months after Prince George's transformative dinner at Thornfield, Margaret found herself preparing for what would be the most significant meal service in the estate's recent history. August 15 marked the 25th anniversary of that last dinner, and the royal family had made an unprecedented decision: they would gather at Thornfield to commemorate the occasion with intention rather than avoidance. The preparation had taken weeks. Margaret worked closely with Catherine and Prince William to design an evening that would honor Diana's memory while maintaining the privacy protections that remained essential to the family's well-being. It was a delicate balance, creating space for celebration while preserving the boundaries that had kept this sacred space safe from public intrusion. The guest list was carefully curated to include only those who had known Diana personally and could share authentic memories rather than media-constructed narratives. Thomas had been given special permission to invite his daughter Sarah, who had worked as a junior staff member during Diana's visits and had treasured memories of the princess's kindness to the estate's younger employees. Margaret arrived at Thornfield on the morning of August 15 to find the entire estate transformed. The gardens had been planted with white roses, Diana's favorite, and the dining room had been arranged with subtle changes that honored her memory. A single white rose sat at each place setting, and the menu featured dishes that Thomas remembered Diana particularly enjoying. most significantly, the seating arrangement had been completely reimagined. Instead of avoiding the east wall, the family would sit facing it directly, acknowledging the mirror that had become a symbol of both violation and, eventually, inclusion. Prince George had suggested this change, arguing that turning away from the mirror gave it power over them, while facing it directly reclaimed that power for their family. Victoria arrived mid-morning, carrying a leather portfolio that Margaret had never seen before. The estate manager's usual stern efficiency was softened by something that looked almost like anticipation. "Miss Chen," Victoria said, "there's something I need to show you before the guests arrive. Something that will help you understand why tonight is so important." She opened the portfolio to reveal a collection of photographs, letters, and documents that Margaret realized represented a complete record of Diana's visits to Thornfield. There were pictures of her helping in the garden, laughing with staff members, playing games with the younger royals. The images showed a woman completely at ease, radiant with the kind of happiness that comes from feeling truly accepted and safe. "These have been locked away for 25 years, Victoria explained. "We were afraid that any reminder would be too painful, that any evidence of her happiness here would make her absence more unbearable. But Prince George was right when he said we were letting fear control our relationship with her memory." Margaret studied the photographs, seeing Thornfield as it had been during Diana's visits, a place of genuine warmth and laughter, where formal protocols gave way to authentic family connection. In several images, Diana was seated at the dining room table, facing the east wall mirror, her reflection capturing moments of pure joy. "Tonight," Victoria continued, "we're going to display these photographs throughout the estate. Not as a shrine or a museum exhibit, but as evidence of the happiness she found here. The family wants visitors to see that Thornfield was a place where she could simply be herself." The afternoon brought a steady stream of arrivals. Catherine came first, accompanied by her children, who had requested to participate in honoring an aunt they had never met but whose influence on their family had shaped their entire lives. Prince Edward arrived with his wife, carrying a small wrapped package that he handled with particular care. Prince William and Prince George arrived together, and Margaret noticed how much more confident George appeared compared to his first visit. He moved through Thornfield like someone who understood its rhythms and respected its purposes, but was no longer intimidated by its unspoken rules. The final guests were Sir James Morrison and his wife, along with Thomas's daughter Sarah, now a woman in her 40s who carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned discretion in royal service but never forgot the warmth of human connection. As evening approached, Margaret supervised the final preparations with a sense of anticipation unlike anything she had experienced in her career. This wasn't just another dinner service, it was a family's attempt to transform their relationship with grief, to find a way to honor loss without being imprisoned by it. At 7 o'clock, the guests gathered in the salon for champagne before dinner. Margaret watched through the service window as they shared stories and laughter, the atmosphere markedly different from the careful tension that had characterized previous gatherings. There was still reverence, still respect for the significance of the occasion, but it was balanced by something new, permission to remember with joy. Prince Edward stepped forward, holding the small package Margaret had noticed earlier. "Before we go into dinner," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "I wanted to share something with all of you. This is a letter Diana wrote to our mother after her last visit here. We found it among her papers, and I think tonight is the right time to share what she said about Thornfield." He opened the package to reveal several pages of handwritten stationery in Diana's distinctive script. As he began to read, Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Dearest Mama," Prince Edward began, "I've just returned from the most wonderful weekend at Thornfield, and I wanted you to know how grateful I am for these precious times with family. There's something magical about that place, perhaps it's the way everyone can simply be themselves without cameras or protocols or expectations. The dinner last night was perfect, full of laughter and terrible jokes and the kind of conversation that makes you remember why family matters so much." He paused, his voice growing thick with emotion before continuing. "I know the boys sometimes find royal life overwhelming, but evenings like these show them that underneath all the ceremony and duty, we're just a family that loves each other. Thomas made my favorite lamb, and Catherine told the most ridiculous story about her riding lesson disaster, and I felt so grateful for these moments when we can forget about being public figures and remember how to be human beings." The room was completely silent except for the soft sounds of people trying not to cry. Margaret watched as Catherine reached for William's hand, as George wiped his eyes without embarrassment, as Sarah smiled through her tears at the memory of that perfect evening. Prince Edward folded the letter carefully. She ended by saying that she hoped we would always have Thornfield as a sanctuary, a place where love could exist without performance. Tonight feels like the fulfillment of that hope. As they moved into the dining room, Margaret noticed that the usual nervousness had been replaced by something deeper and, more sustaining, purpose. These people weren't gathering despite their grief, but because of their love for Diana, love for each other, love for the possibility of healing that honored rather than avoided their loss. The seating arrangement placed Prince George directly across from the east wall mirror, with Catherine to his right and Prince William to his left. Instead of the careful avoidance that had characterized previous meals, the family was literally facing their fear and transforming it into something beautiful. Thomas served the first course with hands that shook slightly, but his face radiated a peace Margaret had never seen before. As he placed the soup course before Catherine, she looked up at him with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Thomas," she said quietly. "For protecting this place, for protecting us, and for helping us find our way back to joy." The dinner conversation flowed naturally between stories about Diana and updates about current family activities. George shared a school project he was working on about media ethics and privacy rights. Catherine described her recent visit to a children's hospital where she had been reminded of Diana's gift for connecting with people in difficult circumstances. As the meal progressed, Margaret realized she was witnessing something unprecedented, a royal family choosing vulnerability over protection, emotional honesty over careful control. The security restrictions remained in place: no cameras, no recording devices, no unauthorized personnel. But, within those boundaries, they had created space for authentic remembrance. During the main course, something remarkable happened. Catherine raised her wineglass and looked directly at the great mirror on the east wall. "To Diana," she said simply. "Who taught us that royal duty and human love don't have to be separate things? Who showed us that dignity comes not from hiding our emotions, but from choosing how and when and with whom to share them?" The toast was echoed around the table, and, for a moment, Margaret could swear she saw something in the mirror beyond the reflected images of the diners. Perhaps it was the candlelight, perhaps it was the emotion of the evening, but, for just an instant, she glimpsed what the room might have looked like 25 years ago, full of laughter and love and the presence of someone who had understood that the most precious privacy wasn't about hiding pain, but about protecting joy. As the evening drew to a close, the family gathered once more before the east wall mirror. This time, instead of avoiding it or fearing it, they stood together facing their reflections, seeing themselves as Diana might have seen them, not as public figures managing a crisis, but as a family who had learned to carry love and loss together. Prince George spoke for all of them when he said, "I think she would be proud of us tonight. Not because we've moved on or forgotten, but because we've learned how to remember her without being afraid of the remembering." Margaret supervised the final cleanup with a heart full of gratitude. As she packed away the special china and folded the white linens, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come to Thornfield thinking her job was to enforce restrictions and maintain protocols. She was leaving with the understanding that her true role had been much more important, helping a family find their way from protection to healing, from avoidance to integration. Thomas approached her as she prepared to leave, carrying one of the white roses from the evening's arrangements. "For you," he said simply. "With gratitude for helping us remember that security isn't just about keeping dangers out, sometimes it's about keeping love in." As Margaret drove away from Thornfield that night, she knew she would never see it the same way again. The estate would continue to function as a private retreat for the royal family. The security measures would remain in place, the privacy protocols would be maintained, the careful management of media access would continue. But now she understood that the most important security at Thornfield wasn't about protecting people from external threats, it was about protecting their capacity to love, to grieve, to remember, and to heal in their own time and their own way. The odd security restrictions at royal dinner tables that nobody mentioned weren't really about food service or seating arrangements or conversation topics. They were about something far more fundamental: the human need for sacred space, for sanctuary, for places where private people could be private without losing their connection to the public world they served. Margaret had learned that true security sometimes meant building walls, but sometimes it meant taking them down. Sometimes it meant avoiding painful subjects, but sometimes it meant creating safe spaces to encounter them. Sometimes it meant protecting people from their memories, but sometimes it meant protecting their right to remember with love instead of fear. The rules at Thornfield would evolve, but their purpose would remain constant, ensuring that powerful people remained human beings, that public figures retained private hearts, and that families could grieve and heal and celebrate together without losing their dignity or their authenticity. As she pulled into her own driveway, Margaret realized that her time at Thornfield had taught her something invaluable about the relationship between security and love. Real protection didn't come from avoiding all risks, it came from creating spaces safe enough to take the risks that mattered most. The risk of vulnerability, the risk of authentic emotion, the risk of loving someone so deeply that losing them could reshape your entire world. The royal family had taken that risk with Diana, and they had paid the price when her private joy became public property. But, on this August evening, 25 years later, they had taken another risk, the risk of healing, the risk of remembrance, the risk of transformation. And, in taking that risk, they had discovered something precious, that love was stronger than loss, that joy could coexist with grief, and that the most powerful security of all was the courage to keep one's heart open even after it had been broken. The odd security restrictions at royal dinner tables would continue, but now they served a different purpose. Instead of simply protecting against pain, they protected the possibility of healing. Instead of merely avoiding difficult conversations, they created space for the conversations that mattered most. And, in the great mirror on the east wall of Thornfield's dining room, future family gatherings would reflect not just the faces of those present, but the enduring presence of love that transcends loss, memory that transforms pain into purpose, and the understanding that true security comes not from building higher walls, but from finding the courage to open guarded hearts.